Okay, today we're going to be talking about higher order array methods. These are methods that take a callback as an argument. So instead of, index of taking a value, you'll be passing a function into the methods to run. They loop through the entire array. They can't break out early. It's not like a for loop where you can return or break and it'll end it. It'll run it for each element. And it doesn't mutate the original array, with a caveat of, for most of them, all the ones we'll be looking at today don't mutate the original array. When you use ones like sort, which can take a callback, not necessarily. It has sort of like a default callback that it does under the hood. But if you want to sort based on something specific, you can pass a callback into that, and that mutates the array. So anytime you use sort, no, it mutates the array. I know with the Sudoku problem, sometimes problems arise with that. And that's, I know the first time I did, I was like, I'm going to sort it all. And that gave me problems. So the first one we're going to look at is forEach. All of these, because they're array methods, you call it off of the array. So you call fruits, which is the array, dot forEach, and then this is where you put the callback. So if we do one more. Oops. So if we have an array here, my array, and we just have it be like number 1, 2, 3, 4, we can make a function, function log this num, and it takes a number, and it just console logs that number. So nothing's being returned, it's just sort of like a straightforward function. And the way we would use this function with forEach, we could do my array.forEach, and we pass in log this num. And notice you don't invoke the function within forEach because you're giving it the function to run on each iteration. forEach will worry about invoking it. You just have to pass it the variable name that is holding that function, or you can do an anonymous function, which we'll do in a second. So if we run this, it logs out each of the numbers. And because it doesn't mutate it, if we console log my array, it should still be what it is on line 1. So that's really useful if you want to go through all of the elements of an array and do a specific task, but maybe you don't want to do a for loop. This is another option. Yes? Yes, but you would need to wrap it in a function. So if we wanted to pass in, like we don't want to declare a function and everything. We know it's super short. We could do forEach, and then you would do function that takes num, and you console log num. And this, whatever value you put here, you want to put here, it's sort of the parameter you name it will be that element. So if we run this, we should see it does it again. So you don't have to have it separate, but you do have to wrap it in a function. One thing to note is forEach returns undefined. It's not going to return the array it just iterated through or anything. We'll see map, filter, reduce, forEach. They all return something slightly different, so knowing what it returns is important of how you can chain off of it or use the value. So if we do var result of forEach, and then we console log result of forEach, that should be undefined because it's forEach returns undefined.
So in that function, you just return console log and then, or
great question. So if we say return num, like maybe we want to console log, then we want to return num, it will still return undefined because for each itself is returning undefined. And we'll see returning num or whatever we want to return will be useful in like map and filter and reduce, but with for each we don't worry about the return value. We just want to perform some operation on that number.
And there's no way to use the arguments that you pass through to make for each return?
Yeah, no, for each will always return undefined. And that's important to know also because some things like map, you can chain. We'll see examples of like doing .map without having to create a new variable each time. For each, because it returns undefined, you can't map or do any array methods off of it. For each can take more than the callback that for each accepts can take more than just the number. So if we did myArray.forEach and we have a function, it takes num, and we console log num, this is what we had before, but this function can also take two optional arguments. Sometimes they're useful, like the index of the element that you're currently on. So we can also console log the index. And you can see the index is 0, num is 1. Let's make these like 10, 20. Just make it easier to see. So the index is 0, 1, 2, 3. So with the for loop, sometimes having that index is important because we want to do some operation like on every other element, for example. And the last optional argument that for each takes is the array that it's iterating through. So we can put the third argument here, and if we console log array, we should see 10, 20, 30, 40 logged out each time. And you can see it's not being mutated or anything like that. Yeah.
Do you need to pass through ARR as an argument in order to return it? Is it your operator?
That is a great question, and in this case, you could totally just use myArray, the variable, but if you're chaining several things, like it's myArray.map.forEach, then you would have access to that array that was sort of the intermediate that map returned.
So like you could operate on ARR but then
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, some things to note about for each is it doesn't it doesn't modify the original array, so you don't have to worry about slicing it and then for eaching. So that's really nice, especially for a functional program. We don't want to be modifying things, and that it returns undefined. The main thing to know about the callback that for each takes is the first argument is the element you're iterating through. Very rarely will you need the actual index and array. Normally just that element is enough, but if it's needed, you can pass in those optional arguments.
So does it already know that the first one is individual element, the second one would be index, and the third would be the array?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it'll do all that stuff under the hood, and you don't have to worry about it. You just need to know what order to pass it in. And you can look up, if you ever forget, you can look up the documentation. So let's go to and it'll tell you, it'll give you, examples. It'll give you the syntax. These like brackets mean optional. So the current value is needed, but the index is optional, the array is optional. The this arg, we don't talk about the keyword this in this class, but just know that you can set the this context with for each if you need it. I've never used it, but it could definitely come in handy in certain situations. And you can see the return value is undefined. And so the documents are really key when you're sort of like, I want to use this method, but I forget how. It gives nice examples. Cool. So it takes this one, it takes the value, logs it out, returns undefined. This is an example of passing the anonymous function. If we know what we want to do and we only want to use that function once. This is the order of the arguments. First, it can be element and then index. And returning undefined. Okay, map. Map is one of my favorite array methods. It's super useful because of the ability to chain off of each other. So map is similar to forEach, where it iterates through each of the elements in the array you call it on and performs an operation, but whatever that callback returns will be the new value in the array. So if you want to take a series of numbers, if you want to take a series of numbers and see if it's even, so let's change half these to odd, and return a boolean of true or false, so then you have an array of booleans of like this is even, this is not even. We can make our function is even that takes a num and it returns num modulus 2. So then if we do my array dot map, I can just pass in is even. Now because map returns an array, if we want access to that array, because map does not modify the original array, we have to declare a variable and assign the return value to it. So bool my array, because it'll be an array of booleans. And then if we console log it, we should get true, false, true, false. Cool. So it's not mutating the original one though, because we can still my array and it should still be the numbers. Because map is returning a number, or I mean an array, we can do another dot map on it, and this one will be an anonymous function that takes a number. It'll take a boolean because is even is returning a boolean. And then if we console log bool and then we return the boolean, so that way it's still the same. Let's return the bang of the bool. So then the bool my array should be false, true, false, true. So we're going to be just flipping them all in this one. Cool. So now we're logging out true, false, and then we flip them, and now the new array is false, true, false, true. This is more just for fun, like the operations I did. It's not like you would, I mean, maybe you would need this, but you can do a lot within it. One thing with map, similar to forEach, is the first argument it takes in the callback is the element that it's iterating through, but the second and third are both optional, and that's the index and the array, just like before. So we can do a similar thing as before of bool, but at index I in array. So this should give us a quick sentence of like bool true at index 0 and array that. So you have access to all of those arguments similar to forEach. Again, only the first one is needed because you want access to that element, but sometimes having the index is useful. And because map returns an array, again, we could do like a forEach off of a dot map if it's returning. If we forget to return something in our function, what do you think is going to happen? What will this one be? Close. It's actually going to be undefined because a function, if it doesn't return anything, returns undefined. So if you forget to return something in your dot map, you'll have an array of undefines, which maybe you want, but you probably want to be returning whatever new value you want in that array. So in forEach, what you return doesn't really matter, but in map it does. Cool. So yeah, again, unlike forEach, map returns a value, and the new value will be in this new array with the same length as the original. It's just going element by element. Yeah. So in this case, we have multiply by 10. We have the num times this, and we pass in 5, 10, 15. And so the new length of new nums is 3 because it's the same length of the array, and the new nums are 50, 100, and 150. This one is with strings, and it's just going through and capitalizing each string in the array. So this should give us an array of all capital. Whereas then you could see how useful this is because just if we had this function in its own variable name of like capitalize, names.map capitalize would be all that is needed to capitalize each string in that array. So it can be really powerful and easy to read. So if we forget to return from the callback, in this instance we are, changing the letters, but then we're not returning anything, that's going to be bad because then we'll get an array of undefined. And we probably don't want that. If we return a static value, like we don't really care what we're iterating through, every time we're going to just return apples, what do you think we're going to get? Yeah, we're going to have an array with apples in it with a length of 3. So that's, could be useful. Maybe you're like, I don't care what's in this array. Like, I just want new things in it. But you could also just like make an array with that many apples in it. Okay, cool. Any questions on forEach and map? We're going through 4 in this lecture. Those are the first 2.
Why is it returning undefined?
Oh, because the console log is the last thing that was returned, or the last thing that ran. Okay, cool. We're going to move on to filter. Filter is great. Its name really defines like what it's doing. You're taking an array and you're only keeping values that return true based on the callback you pass in. So in forEach, we didn't care what was returned. In map, we were returning what we want the new value to be. Filter, we want to return a Boolean dependent on that element and some conditions we lay out. So in this case, we have is even, and we return, the numbers even. And we have numbers, and if we pass nums.filter is even, this new array that's returned will be only numbers that pass the callback, that the callback is returning true for. So the length may be different than the original one because it might not have all the same elements. But the elements will still have the same value. You're not mutating the elements' values in this. So if we have an array of like mixed values or types, and the first one is a string, the second one is a number, the third one is true, the fourth one is false, and the fourth one is 4, and the fifth one is 5. So we have 3 numbers. We also have a Boolean and a string. And we want to filter over this array to only have the numbers before we perform some like map functionality, because we only want to be doing that on numbers. So if we have a function is, number, and it takes a number, or let's have this be val, that's misleading. It takes a value that might be a number, and we return if the type of number. So if this is passed in, it's a string, type of val will be string, so this will be false. But the second one, too, the type of val will be number, so it'll be true. So if we do var num array, set it equal to mixed array dot filter is number, we should get just an array of 2, 4, and 5. Nice. Let me cancel like this. Cool. So now we only have 2, 4, and 5. So it's useful. So filter returns an array. If we had a function that returned false for everything, it would just return an empty array. So if we have like go away, like we don't care what the val is, we just want to again return like a static thing, return false. We have go away here. It should just be an empty array because nothing passes the filter, but it'll still return an array. So you can still chain things off of it and not have an error of like, I don't know what dot map is of a number. Because filter returns a number, then we could do another, do we still have is even? Yeah. We could do dot filter is even, and then it will only be even numbers in this, so 2 and 4. So that's useful.
If you put something in there that was like a string of 2, would it try to coerce the string into a number?
Great question. It will do whatever that operation would be. So with is number, it will just like return false if we have a string of 2. But with the is even, I'm not sure what the modulus coerces it into. So let's see what happens when we just do filter is even. Oh, yeah, so it seems to coerce it. Because true would be coerced into 1. And I'm guessing this would be coerced in, oh wait, we haven't grabbed it. Okay, interesting, yeah. And you can see with this, it keeps the original value. So like it might have coerced it in the function, but it's not going to then be returning it as a number. Great question.
So with filter, would you ever write any other lines of code within the function, or are you just going to open or within the function that you're going to use for filter? Would it always just be like return and then something that's going to be true or false?
So the last line will always be return and then some sort of Boolean, but you could do operations beforehand. Maybe you want to like call some other functions to do some operations or something and then return a Boolean.
But you always
Yeah.
have to return the Boolean.
Yeah, because that's going to determine whether or not it's being added to it. With filter, just how let me just comment this out. Just how the callback function can take more than one parameter. This one can take the same ones that we've been talking about, the index and the array, as the second and third, which are totally optional. So if we put an anonymous function in here, we have the first one be num, I, and then array, then we could console log num, and maybe we want to do this because if we want only the even numbers that have an even index. And then we'll return type of val is number. So this will, num array will still be a good name for it. Cool. So num is 1, array is 0, and then index is 0, and then array is this. Notice that the array that we're logging now is not changing because we have access to the array we're iterating through, not the array that's being returned. Because filter is not modifying it. If we console log mixed array, then it should still be the same as before. Oh, and I don't know why. Oh, because this is num, not val. So it's still the same as before, which is great. We can have like a non-modifying operation that we can also have a return value. Remember, you have to assign a variable name for the return value, otherwise that array is sort of just like lost. Like it's there, but like you can't access it. One other thing, similar to how we saw in the, which one was it? The forEach, how we can set the context of this. We don't learn about this, but let's say we have my obj and we set it equal to key value, like hello, and true. And then we pass in my obj here. If we console logged this, it would be my obj. Which is not super, you can see that it got highlighted special because it's a special keyword. Not super useful in the things you'll be learning, but keep in mind that you can set the context of this. It's super useful in like React and other frameworks you'll learn later on. Cool. Any questions on filter? Cool. So what if the callback always returns true? Then the numbers would be the same. Same with false, it will be empty. Cool. The last one we're going to do today is reduce. Reduce is great, super useful, but takes a while to get comfortable with because there's a few small tweaks compared to the other methods we learned today. Yeah, it took me a while to get comfortable with reduce. So unlike other methods, it'll get there. Some people it clicks real fast, but it is sort of funky. So it takes two arguments. It takes the callback that we're going to run, and then it takes a accumulating value or the start value. So add to sum, we have our callback function, which we'll go over, the callback function you make for reduce, and then 0. So we want to start adding all the numbers in the array, 5, 10, 15, to 0 as our starting one. So we're adding sum to the next number. If we had like 100 here or something, it would add 5, 10, 15 to 100. And one thing to note is if you don't give it this one, technically it's optional in the fact that if you don't give it this start value, just the callback, it'll have the first element in your array be that start value that you're accumulating on, but it'll start the iteration of the callback on the second one, so at index 1. So if you want to do some things before you like accumulate, like condense the values, you want to make sure that you give it a start value so it does it on that first element as well. And reduce doesn't return necessarily an array unless what you're accumulating into is another array. It will return whatever the return value is, which is normally, like, it's this, because this is a number and we're returning a number plus a number, the return value of reduce will be a number, because it'll be just one number. So let's look at an example of, let's look at a string example. We've done a lot of numbers today. Reduce. Cool. So we have a string, or an array, fruits, and we have oranges, apples, and is melon a fruit? Melon? We'll say it is. And then we have a function. I like fruit, and it takes the accumulator and the element that we're, or the fruit string, which is the element that we're iterating over. And we want to return accumulator plus fruit. Yeah. So this will take whatever this accumulator value is and add the fruit string to it. Let's add a space in there because I have a feeling that will be one space off. So then var yum fruits is fruits dot reduce, and then we're going to pass in I like fruit, and then our starter string, which is I like, and then we'll add oranges, apples, melons to that. So the return value of yum fruits should be I like oranges, apples, melons, to make it consistent. Yeah, so one thing to note, this callback function we're creating for reduce, it's a little bit different than the other callback functions we had before, where the callback functions before, the first argument was the element we were iterating over. For reduce, the first element is this accumulator value that gets added to each iteration. The second one is that element that we're iterating through. So sometimes, for me at least, that trips me up where I'm used to it being in a certain order. Just remember reduce is first the accumulator and then the element that we're on. So on each step, the accumulator gets added to based on the return value. The accumulator is the return value from the previous iteration. So if we console log the accumulator here, this should start as I like because that's the starter value, so the first accumulator value, and then it'll have a new, then it's oranges, apples, and then the last one is all three. So does that make sense how we have some sort of value or some sort of, value that we're adding to on each iteration? So it can be useful if you want to perform some sort of cumulative calculation of some sort.
So, if you were to remove accumulator from the function of a fruit, would it then only return a bunch of apples? Or would it return everything?
So if we have this, so this, if we just had to return fruit,
No, that's not from the arguments.
from this, so the first argument will always be the accumulator. So it'll think fruit is, in this instance, I like. So it'll just return I like every time. Oh, oops. Yeah, so it's, the order matters, where you put the parameters.
Wait, so any function that you pass into a reduce function is going to be inside of those two parameters?
So yeah. So we can also do, anonymous functions. That's sort of common for reduce function methods because there's not many cases where you'll have a function that takes like an accumulator and like an element that won't be in a reduce. It's sort of specific. So you won't have something like is even that you can pass to it. So we could put an anonymous function here that takes the accumulator and the element, and then we can say return accumulator plus element dot to uppercase. We want to like scream all the fruits out. I like oranges, apples, melons. And again, if we don't have this I like, it'll have the accumulator start as the first one and then perform the callback starting with index 1, so the second element. So if we just have return accumulator plus element to uppercase with no callback, we'll get oranges in lowercase, then apples and melons in uppercase. So again, if what you're doing within the reduce function is important, you have tasks to perform on it, I'll always put in a start value as sort of like a safety guard, even if it's something simple like 0 or an empty string. Because then, if we put an empty string here, they'll all be capital. Let me see. So reduce itself takes 2 arguments, the callback function and the start value. But the callback that reduce takes 2 required ones, the accumulator and the element, like we saw. But again, just like before, there's 2 other arguments that can be passed in, the index and the array. So we can still have index and array. We still have access to those within the callback. So we can console log I in array is element. So 0 in oranges is oranges. Any questions on reduce? Again, it doesn't mutate the array, so if we console log out fruits, it'll still be the same. So that's really nice. It's, doesn't mutate it, but, and reduce, the return value is whatever the return, or the return type is whatever the return type of the callback is. So keep that in mind, especially when you want to chain things together, unless you're returning an array. Maybe you have an array as your accumulator and you're pushing into it. You can't do like a dot map off of it. But because this returns a string, we could dot to lowercase off of it, just like we would. So this uppercase is it, and then lowercase is it. So we just take the strings on a ride of like screaming and then not, and then ends with it normal. Cool. So yeah, unlike the other ones, reduce takes 2. The second one is the starting value. It does iterate through each element of the array, unless you don't put the starting value. But it is that second argument. So be mindful of the order you place the arguments in reduce. So this accumulator, the first time this function is called is this value. And we went over what happens if we don't pass a start value into it. So what happens to the accumulator after each iteration is that return value of the previous iteration is the new accumulator. So because in this case it returns return value, the next iteration accumulator will be that string. So that's important to note, because if you're returning something static, you're never accumulating. So it can be super useful. A lot of the times on Code Wars, when you see like one of the top upvoted answers, it's normally using reduce, because you can do a lot of stuff in just a few lines of code. So in this one, we're summing them up. This is a really nice way to sum up all the numbers in an array. So on the first iteration, the sum, which is the accumulator, is 0 because that's the start value. The next num, which is the element that we're currently iterating over, is 1. And then the return value is sum plus 1, or 0 plus 1, so it'll be 1. So now in the second iteration, sum is this return value, is 1. The element we're on is 2, so the return value is 3. And so third iteration, again, this new accumulator value is the return value from before. So now we have 6, we add 4 to that, it's 10, and then we add 5 to it, it's 15. Does that sort of make sense how the new value gets every time? Any questions on reduce? This one takes practice using it, so yeah, have fun playing with it today, but if you're not quite getting it the first time, that's fine. It takes a while to get used to. Method chaining. As you saw before, we can chain methods if it's returning an array. Both filter and map return arrays. So we can do nums.filter.map. So we want to only multiply by 10 our odd numbers. So 5 and 15. So this console log of new nums, what should be in this array? Exactly. So we only grab the odd ones, it returns an array of the odd numbers, and then it multiplies it by 10. And this is nice because we don't even need to see this function is odd and multiply by 10. Like if it's named appropriately, we're pretending no one's playing a trick on us or anything. This is really nice and easy to read. We can see we have an array of numbers and we're going to filter out only the odd ones and then multiply them all by 10. Like it's almost pseudocode. So this is much better than declaring odd numbers and having that be the return value of nums.filter is odd, and then having new nums, which is odd nums.map. So if you feel like you're declaring a lot of variables, which is totally fine to do when you're first writing a function, maybe you want to be console logging each time to make sure you're only getting the odd numbers. But once you know it's working, see where you can implement some chaining to make it a little bit more tight of a line of code. Because as you see here, this isn't like separate lines of code. This is all one line of code doing this work. One thing to note syntactically, if I wanted to chain a bunch of methods, I can do new array is my array dot map is even, and then a common way to do chaining is to line up all the periods. Oh wait, no, we want to do filter is even dot map add 100 dot reduce sum and 0. So in this case, we have my array. We're going to grab all the even ones, add 100, and then sum them all up with a start value of 0. And this is how syntactically you could write it, where it's really easy to just boom, 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 sort of see it almost in bullet points. And you don't have a semicolon at the end because this is the same as saying this. You're just breaking it up into multiple lines of code. So this is the same as this with just like some white space to make it easier to read, because this could get cumbersome if you have like long method names or something. This way you have more bullet points. I don't know. I like bullet points more than a sentence. Yeah. Any questions on method chaining? When to do it, when not? What's a method we learned today that we could not chain off of? Exactly, yeah. So you're never going to have a method chained off of forEach. Unless for some reason, yeah, because it's returning undefined. I couldn't think of a time when you could chain something off of undefined because undefined has no methods. Yeah, so, yeah. Yes?
But can you chain forEach to the second one, so you could filter something first and then do forEach on it?
Exactly, yeah. So forEach can be the last one in like a chain of methods, but you can't have it be like in the middle or first. You can't chain off of it.
Oh.
Any other questions about array methods or anything? Okay, cool.